On August 22nd, South Korea announced it is scrapping the bilateral pact with Japan.
정부는 한일 간 군사 비밀 정보 보호에 관한 협정 지소미아를 종료하기로 결정하였으며 협정에 따라 연장 통보 시한 내에 외교 경로를 통하여 일본 정부에 이를 통보할 예정입니다.
GSOMIA is a military information sharing pact that allows South Korea and Japan to exchange information including spy satellites, North Korea and more. The two sides have been renewing the agreement every year since 2016. The decision came after President Moon Jae-in held meetings with the National Security Council.
양국 간 안보 협력 환경에 중대한 변화를 초래한 것으로 평가했습니다. 이러한 상황에서 정부는 안보상 민감한 군사정보 교류를 목적으로 체결한 협정을 지속하는 것이 우리의 국익에 부합하지 않는다고 판단하였습니다.
Controversy regarding whether South Korea should use GSOMIA as a countermeasure to Japan's export curbs has lingered for some time. The Blue House said exchanging military information with Tokyo does not meet national interest. It also stressed Japan showed no intention to change its stance after the foreign ministerial meeting and President Moon's address on Korean Liberation Day. Seoul said it plans to inform Tokyo its intent through a diplomatic channel. The termination of GSOMIA has rolled the bilateral relations further down to the pitfall, and the tensions are running high in and around Northeast Asia.
And to help us dissect today's topic into a digestible bite, we're joined in the studio by Yang Jun-seok, Professor of Economics from Catholic University. Professor Yang, thank you for being here with us.
Happy to be here.
What will be Japan's response? It seems quite concerned about losing this ability to share intel with South Korea regarding North Korean activities.
Well, GSOMIA is partially used to share information about North Korea, and Korea gets something out of it as well. Japan apparently has better satellite technology, better information on how surveillance, whereas Korea apparently has better access to human intelligence. So both sides are getting something out of this, but still, one problem may be that Japan may feel that Korea is even less of a trustworthy security partner. So that's a risk there, which is why I say that make it clear that Korea may re-examine it when the situation gets better.
It's a double-edged sword in some sense.
In some sense, it's a useful leverage. Problem is, do you want to use that leverage because it has such important implication for the regional defense as well as relationship with the United States?
Right. Well, it's time to ask an expert in Japan about how the locals are reacting to the GSOMIA issue. We have Jonathan Berkshire Miller, Senior Fellow from Japanese Institute of International Affairs, connected via Skype. Hello there, Jonathan.
Well, thanks again for having me on.
Well, thank you for being here with us. The trade spat has put GSOMIA at stake. How are Japanese people reacting to the situation regarding the bilateral military pact?
Well, with regard to the General Security of Military Information Agreement, or the GSOMIA Security Pact, I think this is something that's concerned security experts on both sides and also in the U.S. Traditionally, Japan-South Korea relations, even through the worst times, have been able to kind of quarantine or, in a way, immunize the security side of their cooperation. And I think the reason for that is because there's a shared security interest in sharing information and intelligence as it pertains to, in particular, to the Korean Peninsula and North Korea's WMD and missile programs. So this is exactly what this agreement is supposed to do. This agreement was signed in 2016, and it should be noted this was very difficult to get done. Japan and South Korea had tried to get this agreement done in 2012 at one point, and South Korea unfortunately pulled out at the last minute due to its own kind of pressures. A story was leaked about this agreement being kind of signed at that point in time. So I think that this indeed is a very, very significant agreement. And the reason why I think this would be very disappointing is not only would it curb some of the information and intelligence sharing between Japan and Korea, but it's also important to contextualize this agreement as, in a way, kind of a building block, or a foundation block for broader security and defense cooperation between Seoul and Tokyo. There are other agreements in addition to the GSOMIA that should be pursued, and my belief is in the shared interest of both countries. Another such agreement would be a acquisition and cross-servicing arrangement, which would essentially allow for logistics sharing and help better for contingency planning, be it a crisis in the Korean Peninsula where Japan needs to evacuate its citizens. So I think GSOMIA, not renewing GSOMIA in a way would kind of take things in the opposite direction. I think it would be very, very difficult to kind of build back that trust in the security side.
Well, it's sounding clear that Tokyo does want to keep the pact. Jonathan, we want to know your thoughts on other issues apart from GSOMIA, so do stick with us for a bit. Now, coming back to you, Professor Young, it looks like Japan's whitelist will take effect soon, August 28th, I believe. They might deliberately tighten export curbs on many other goods. What's the anticipated economic impact, if that's the case, on South Korea?
Okay, well, there's about 1,200 goods on that list. Korea has identified 100 of those 1,200, which could be critical for Korea. Luckily, most of them are not as critical as those 3 chemicals, which deals with the semiconductor industry. Most of them, replacements can be found, or domestic replacements can be developed within 1 or 2 years. But still, there are a few more critical components in there that could have a big effect on Korean industry. The ones that are mentioned most often is not only the 3 chemicals with the semiconductor industry, but other fine chemicals which are used in the production process, manufacturing equipment, including manufacturing equipment for semiconductors and displays, but not only semiconductors and displays, but also other manufacturing equipment which are used to build machinery in Korean small and medium-sized businesses. There's also specialty steel that cannot be easily found elsewhere, and carbon fibers which are used for hydrogen tanks for hydrogen energy, hydrogen vehicles, and sensors which are used in, say, things like remote control. In fact, one economist, when he's emphasizing how much effect that these kind of export controls can have on Korea, you have $20,000 to $40,000 automobiles, and you have remote controls that opens the doors. Some of those remote controls depend on these Japanese sensors, and it's not even that expensive. It's maybe $10. But because of that $10 component is not available, you cannot make these $40,000 cars. There can be a lot of problems with if Japan places more goods on individual export control. Having said that, though, I'm not sure if Japan will place more goods on individual controls because, well, for one thing, they've been saying to the international press that they're not going to be vindictive. They're doing this because of security purposes, and they have no reason to control goods that are going to Korea for civilian purposes. So we'll have to watch whether Japan keeps its word. But the effect of the export controls, we won't really see until we see exactly which goods are placed on individual control lists by Japan on the 28th.
Seoul plans to strip Tokyo of trusted trading partner status, so we'll be taking another step possibly and impose export restrictions on goods to Japan like DRAM and OLED. How do you perceive this move? As something constructive, positive, or something we should try and avoid?
Well, I think reciprocal movement is always a good strategic move when you're dealing with these type of negotiations. Now, Japan has put goods on the control list, but so far they have not formally restricted exports yet. For 3 chemicals, they can argue that they're still in the process of processing the paperwork. Korea I think we could put the DRAMs and OLEDs on the control list as well and use the same argument. Tit for tat is usually a valid move in diplomacy and international trade negotiations. But after that, should we have an export quota? That's, I think, another problem. My feeling is that, well, if you look at the GATT agreement, Article 20, general exceptions, if there's a shortage of a product, then that could be used as a justification for export quota. And if the domestic supply of semiconductors and OLED chips are restricted because we're not getting the materials from Japan, then I think we could use that Article 20 to perhaps put an export quota on Japanese exports to DRAMs and the OLED chips. Problem is, it will probably not hurt Japan as much as Korea. So that's a move that we'll have to examine whether we actually want to use it at that time. But to give a signal that if Japan reduces the exports of the critical chemicals, then, and if that results in a shortage in Korea, then we can reduce exports to Japan. I think that's a good signal to give. If you do this to us, we'll do this to you. But if you don't do it, we won't do it either.
Not the best option, but something we need to do to send a clear message. Now, let's go back to Jonathan for further discussions on today's topic. Jonathan, in response to Japan's measures, South Korea also removed Japan from its whitelist. How do you think this will affect bilateral ties?
Yeah, so with regard to the whitelist, as you noted, South Korea has now kind of responded reciprocally in its opinion and kind of taken Japan off its whitelist of trusted traders in this regard. I think the reaction in Tokyo is not overly surprised by this. I think that this is something that it's not welcome from Japan's perspective, but it's also something that has not really shocked many in Japan. I think the focus now will be to kind of keep this very much on this particular issue of export controls, is to keep this very much a conversation between the experts in both bureaucracies, and try to kind of, in a way, kind of tamp down some of the discussions or some of the tendency to kind of take this at a political level. I think what Japan will not be happy to see is if this continues to be kind of a priority at the highest political levels in South Korea, but I think would much more prefer to have these discussions at the expert level.
And we have another contributor joining us to add more depth to our discussion. Connected via Skype from Singapore, Amir Alvars, a senior market strategist at Asymmetric Advisors. Welcome aboard.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us today. Amir, how would Seoul and Tokyo's tit-for-tat move regarding the whitelist affect their relations from here on?
Well, I mean, obviously, it's gonna worsen the situation. I mean, that goes without saying. It's escalating. The deterioration in bilateral relationship between Korea and Japan. The Japanese have been a little bit more forthcoming in providing the licenses required for some of the exports. So there hasn't been any disruptions thus far. I think it would be wise for the Japanese to continue providing these export licenses because, as I've explained before in different news media, that I think that over the medium to longer term, the Japanese companies are the ones that are likely to be hurt. We're already seeing that with signs of SK Hynix talking about potentially looking for alternative equipment suppliers. Remember that the equipment side has not been on the subject of any export curbs so far, even though both countries have taken each other out from the whitelist. But until now, we haven't really needed any export licenses for equipment. But what we're seeing already is that there are signs where the Koreans, where they can, they're going to start substituting the Japanese materials and equipment for other sources. The other thing that's going to happen, which is far more kind of relevant for me, because I'm a Japan market specialist, is that I think a lot of Japanese companies who've been exporting their products, materials and equipment to the Koreans, they're going to have to move their production bases out of Japan and into other countries in order to escape this export curve over the medium to longer term. So I think the Japanese will try to fight this loss of share by taking their export base outside of Japan. Of course, it will be expensive and costly and unnecessarily so. But that's another kind of move or strategy that I think the Japanese will take to overcome any export curbs that are imposed on them by the Japanese government.
Another question for you, Amir. Tensions are worsening between the two countries. Could Seoul and Tokyo come up with a diplomatic solution? What do you think is the ideal way to resolve this matter?
Okay, so I think that the issue is mainly the court ruling in Korea, which is given a ruling where they can seize Japanese assets. And the Japanese have been asking this court ruling to be overturned. It's a very difficult thing to happen in Korea. It's a sovereign ruling, if you like. So it's going to be tough to overrule this. So the Japanese have found different pretexts, different excuses to put this export curve and eventually taking Korea from their preferred trading partners. So it has to be a give and take from both sides. I think the situation can be resolved if both sides back down. We'll wait and see if that's going to happen. Abe's government is unlikely to back down. They've just won the upper house election. They've got a very strong nationalistic tendencies. Abe's signature policy change is to change the pacifist constitution in Japan, which is something that he really wants to do. So that gives you a pretty good idea that there is a lot of nationalistic tendencies by the Japanese government. So it's going to be tough to come to some sort of a short-term resolution. I think the export licenses will continue to resume and be given. So there are not going to be any disruptions in the short term. But I also think, as I said, the ball is now rolling, and I think the Korean companies are going to start procuring equipment and materials outside of Japan anyway. So that's really what's really relevant for following the Japanese market. So we're looking for the Japanese to eventually lose more market share to their competitors in Europe, in America, and to Korean companies. Yeah.
And this one is for Jonathan. Jonathan, considering ways to improve cooperation and communication could be very helpful in solving the dispute, what advice do you have for the two sides?
Yeah, bilateral relations right now between Japan and South Korea really are at one of their most difficult points in recent years. And I think there's a tendency to kind of look at some of these events and connect them together, whether it be the issue that we're currently discussing now on the whitelist issue, export controls, or be it the more recent issue of wartime labor, and the 1965 treaty between Japan and South Korea. But I think when it comes to kind of looking at a way forward, I think it might be tempting to approach this in a kind of a grand bargain way and look to kind of bundle everything together and see if both sides can kind of find a common way forward. The positive side of this is there are a number of international meetings where both sides will have the opportunity to engage with each other if they do choose to do so. Right now, the climate is not great for bilateral meetings in the sense of having standalone summits, but there are a lot of opportunities, be it APEC, the East Asian Summit, the United Nations General Assembly to have some sort of dialogue at the leaders level. Whether that will happen in a full-on meeting or whether that will be something that happens more in a pull-aside fashion is yet to be seen, or whether it happens at all. And I mean, I think this is something that both sides have to kind of deeply think about ways forward. But I do think that, as I said, when looking at how to kind of go forward in this relationship, it really is important to kind of look piece by piece and ideally have that dealt with by the relevant experts at this juncture, rather than looking for some larger political rapprochement.
As you suggested, it's not about one breakthrough big deal, but working step by step through dialogue to mend the bilateral ties from here on. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming back to you, Professor Jung, it looks like, of course, what we talked about is communication is all important, especially at this point. We've seen the top diplomats of Seoul and Tokyo constantly meeting and holding talks, and some lawmakers also. What other levels of involvement would you expect could help thaw this situation between the two sides?
Well, I think fundamentally, the diplomats and politicians can meet, but they won't be able to get anywhere until the public sentiments on both sides allow a compromise. And I think right now the situation, at least in Korea and maybe in Japan as well, the public sentiment is not one that allows a compromise. I know that at least for Korea's side, if we talk about negotiating on the labor reparation issue, you're going to have a lot of people getting very angry on why do we have to compromise. So right now, I don't think there's any room for negotiation. That means that we're going to have to do something about public sentiment on both sides, and it might be better for politicians and diplomats to have a cooling off period while we let the everyday normal public, first of all, get the heat down a little, and then talk about how we can get beyond this, what is a mutually acceptable compromise, because unless the public sentiment changes, I don't think the politicians will have the courage to find a compromise that will make both sides anger the public on both sides. And because of that, diplomats will not have any room for negotiation.
So if there are limited options or limited impact of diplomats and politicians, what other sectors or people in what different industries would you advise be more involved or engaged with the two sides?
Okay, I think there should be a two-track negotiations. One is on the business side, because the business people on both Japan and Korea have the most to lose. And then you're going to have dialogue with the NGOs which deal with Japanese reparation issues, not only for the forced labor, but for comfort women as well, and the Japanese people who are related to those issues, because they're going to have to find ways to calm the public before we can start real negotiations. Otherwise, Korea is insisting on trade negotiation by itself. Japan is insisting that any trade negotiation be accompanied by negotiations on reparation issue, and they're going to talk not with each other but cross each other unless we can find some compromises there.
Right, this will be a situation where it's not a place where a top-down diplomatic approach would work.
I don't think so, because the diplomats and politicians have only enough room to negotiate as the public allows it. And right now, I think, at least for public in Korea and perhaps in public in Japan as well, they're not really giving a lot of room for negotiation.
Well, we hope they're listening to your pearls of wisdom right now. We appreciate you, Professor Yang Joo-suk, coming in and making our program complete today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Despite growing hopes for a breakthrough in Seoul-Tokyo trade dispute, there is no positive turnaround so far. For our latest developments on this topic, let's roll the clip.
Japan called South Korea's decision to end their military information sharing pact, known as GSOMIA, extremely regrettable and unbelievable. That's according to Japan's Kyodo news agency, citing government officials on Thursday. Other Japanese media were quick to report on the decision as well. NHK reported that despite Washington and Tokyo urging Seoul to maintain the pact, South Korea has decided to terminate it. It then said that the ongoing dispute between Seoul and Tokyo, ignited on the trade front, has extended to the security field. The Japan Times also reported on South Korea's decision, adding that there are concerns on how this could affect the Seoul-Washington-Tokyo security cooperation amid North Korea's continued test firing of missiles. The international media also shed spotlight on this matter. Reuters reported that the decision is likely to be met with dismay in the United States as it fears weakened security cooperation.
While the two close old neighbors continue to be at loggerheads over the trade issues, they both understand in their efforts to remind each other that they can go further together through understanding, cooperation, and free trade. The world is waiting and watching for the two Asian giants to set the example through proper actions. This is where we have to wrap things up. Do join us again for more, same time next week, for a brand new episode of The Point. Thank you for watching.